Good evening. Welcome to SpectraCell's webinar program. Tonight, we continue the series with molecular nutrition and telomeres, the key to biohacking your health span, presented by Dr. Ron Grabowski. A recording of tonight's webcast will be available on our YouTube channel as early as next week. Should you have any questions, please note the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll reserve the last few minutes of the presentation to answer any questions that come through. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ron Grabowski.
Thanks, Liz. This is an exciting topic today, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this presentation. As Liz said, that we are talking about telomeres tonight, and I'm not sure how many of you have ever ordered a telomere test or if what your knowledge is on telomere, but I'm going to give you a little background on telomeres this evening before we really get into the nutritional relationship to telomeres, because some of the information I'm going to mention with the nutritional relationships is you have to have some background to really understand why nutrition can impact telomeres and other activities that can also do that. So as you all know that today, our population is increasing in age, and you can see from this particular top bullet that quite a few of us are going to be over the age of 60 by 2050. Now that sounds like maybe a little ways off, but before we know it, we'll be at 2050. And so everybody's really concerned about the degenerative diseases today, such as Alzheimer's and cardiovascular disease, as well as osteoporosis. Diabetes, we know, is growing on a very large scale today, and it's a big concern. So one of the things that, of course, people are concerned about is how can we change these particular factors that are going to affect our telomeres, which are really related to our aging process. And so once again, as we age, these telomeres are affected, and once again, then that eventually affects our DNA. So the history of telomeres doesn't go back really that far. It's only about since 1930 that these were really discovered and talked about, and you can see here what they really are noted as far as telomere, meaning the end, and that's once again what we'll be talking about. And I'll show you some structures in regards to telomeres and how this is affected and how it affects our DNA and why telomeres are so important to protect our DNA. And is there any way that we can actually slow this process down? And telomerase is definitely one of the things that we concentrate on, and we can manipulate through, once again, dietary changes and or nutrients, which I'll get to at the latter part of this particular webinar. So this is a little timeline of the telomere as far as the discovery and also important points or steps that really brought this forward. And one of the things I want to point out besides the discovery date is if you look on this particular scale in 1985, when they discovered the telomerase enzyme, and you'll see really how important that particular enzyme is and how it plays a role with our telomeres. And then you can see since that time, there's been discovery of other things that have definitely been associated with the telomere and or the telomerase enzyme that people are looking at today. So when we look at these particular products, as you can see here, they're sometimes called the biological clock, and you'll see why that is. But the telomeres are really the end. They're the cap of the chromosome, which really keeps it there and intact so it doesn't get damaged. But every time a cell replicates, we affect these telomeres, and we also affect, of course, the possibility of our DNA. Now, once again, the telomeres are there to protect our DNA, and that's very important, of course, so we don't get changes of our genes and cause, of course, serious diseases, whether it's Alzheimer's, cancer, various other things like that. There's a complex that we talk about that's called Shelterin complex, and this is, as you can see here, a repetitive DNA sequence that more or less helps maintain or is associated with the telomere. And so this is something that we look at. There's like 6 items that we look at with this complex. And we're not really going to get in depth into that particular complex tonight. because I just want to cover the major things about the telomere, the telomerase, and things that we can do from a nutritional standpoint that really affect this. So here's a picture of a chromosome, and of course, and you can see the black ends of the chromosome, and that's your telomere. And the purpose really of that telomere is to prevent damage to the DNA or the genes in that particular structure. And once again, every time a cell replicates, we start to shorten that telomere, and you'll see how often that actually happens. And there are certain structures and amino acids and products that we look at to see how that is really done. The telomerase there, you can see that that comes into play, and that you'll see is very important in regards to protection of the telomere and overall the protection of our genes. As I mentioned, the telomere is a cap to the chromosome per se. And the interesting thing about this is it has certain products, and you can see the major product is guanine, and guanine is easily damaged with reactive oxygen oxidative species, or once again, as we know of, as free radicals. And so one of the things that you will hear me talk about throughout this webinar tonight is how can we decrease the oxidative stress in our body, and especially in our cells, to protect these products from being damaged. Because if we have oxidative stress, we're going to damage the telomere. If we damage the telomere, then we're going to predispose us to damages to the DNA and eventually genes, and cause problems that will eventually cause disease. And so that's one of the major things what we look at. So once again, as you know, there's a lot of antioxidants out there. There's some that have been definitely related to the telomere. There's others that yet have to be studied to see if they do protect this particular structure or not. And there's lifestyle items that really affect our telomere, and we'll get in that tonight. And I think some of them you will actually be surprised on how they can affect this particular structure in our cells. So as I mentioned, the telomerase is a very important enzyme, as it states here that every time a cell divides, a certain number of base pairs, that's what the BP stands for, the base pairs are affected or are lost. And so when that happens, this particular chromosome starts to shorten. So it's kind of like burning a match. As the match is burning, starting at the head of the match, as it starts to burn down the shaft of the match, these particular structures start to shorten. And once again, that predisposes us to potential damage to our DNA and, of course, disease. So as that is occurring, is there a built-in mechanism that actually helps protect us? And the answer is yes, and that's the telomerase enzyme. And this telomerase enzyme reconstitutes, in a way, the telomere. So it slows down or decreases the damage, or kind of rebuilds that particular end of the chromosome and kind of protects it from further damage. Now, once again, this is where we get into the nutrition in the latter part of this talk this evening, is can we, one, protect the telomere? Two, can we help increase the telomerase enzyme? And how can we do that? And is there a certain amount of products or various products or specific products that help do that? And some of the products that I'm going to talk about tonight, you've been introduced to in the past in your practice, I'm sure, and you'll see how that comes into play. And once again, I'll bring that up at the latter part of this particular webinar. So as the telomere length shortens, that's once again of our aging process. And there's this particular slide shows you how this can be related in OBGYN field, for example. As we know that as women get older, that it's more difficult to bear children. And, you know, sometimes people say older than 38, some say 40, some say 42, but this is an example. Human eggs, once again, are affected in the telomere shortening of this particular process. And of course, these women then have an increased possibility of miscarriage or birth defects or infertility because the healthiness of their particular cell. And so as these cells, once again, or I should say as these telomeres are shortening, then once again, the cell becomes more vulnerable to damage. And that makes it, once again, occur in these particular examples in the OBGYN field. So the longer that we can sustain the telomere, and the more likely that we can increase the telomerase enzyme, then we will, once again, per se, slow down the aging process, decrease our chance of chromosome damage, and once again, continue to live a healthy life or avoid some of the major diseases that we're looking at today. And you'll see there's numerous diseases today that have been investigated with the telomere length. So the thing is, the telomeres appear in every nucleated cell. And at birth, every one of us has a certain telomere length. And you can see it shows you, once again, from a scientific and physiological structure, how long that is. And once again, as these telomeres shorten, then once again, certain number of these base pairs start to be affected. And once again, that's what causes our cells to die off, or what causes these things to build up in our cell and eventually cause further problems for our cell. And things like the mitochondria will get damaged. And the mitochondria has a big impact on, once again, the chromosome as well as the telomere. And so you will hear me talk about mitochondrial integrity, and if we maintain the mitochondrial integrity, how we can help preserve these telomere/chromosome structures. And there's a lot of talk today, as you know, in healthcare, especially in this particular field of nutrition, where we want to make sure that our mitochondria are functioning at its peak. Because if it does, and the more mitochondria in our cells survive and are not damaged, then once again, we prevent damages or changes in these particular structures as well. And once again, that's very important. So the leukocyte telomere length has really been the marker of the telomere length in the entire body. So this is really what we look at. And you can see this was documented several years ago. And these are some of the references that support that. So once again, when you order a telomere test, this is really what we're looking at. And as I mentioned, also is one of the major abnormalities or functions or malfunctions of this particular telomere depend upon the oxidative stress. And I also mentioned the dysfunction of the mitochondria. So as the mitochondria kind of goes as far as health or function, in a sense, so does the telomere. Now that's not the only thing that really determines it, but it's a large portion of the cell integrity, the replication, and once again, the overall function of that particular cell. And as I mentioned earlier, every nucleated cell in the body contains, once again, telomeres. There's what we call a secondary telomere structure. And once again, this is a structure that's very, very important to the maintenance of this particular structure. And once again, this prevents the damage or the maintenance of this particular structure. And we'll talk about it more, but magnesium is one of the important minerals that actually works with this particular structure. And if magnesium deficiency is present, once again, it can affect the structure. And we know that magnesium has numerous functions in the body. I don't think a lot of people right now are familiar with magnesium deficiency and telomere integrity, but definitely I'll introduce you to that tonight. And that's why so many diseases today, especially the 5 or 6 major degenerative diseases, usually correlate with magnesium, whether it's diabetes, whether it's osteoporosis, whether it's coronary artery disease, all of those highly are associated with magnesium. And this is one of the reasons why that's happening, is because the correlation with this mineral. The activity, once again, of the telomerase enzyme is extremely important. And once again, if this activity is increased, it's like regenerating or repairing or slowing down the degradation of the telomere. So the telomerase enzyme is instrumental to the maintenance of the telomere length. And that's why, once again, in the future, when you read articles and you hear about some nutrient or some herbal product affecting the enzyme, then you know it's ultimately preserving or affecting the telomere length, which is a good thing. Of course, the higher the telomerase activity, the better for the telomere. So what really affects the telomere length and what really affects our aging? And some of these are very obvious to you and you've heard about, but I'm going to kind of go one by one because some of them, of course, we look at and go, well, this is something I do and that's very good. And for example, the first one, physical activity. Physical activity is definitely beneficial for numerous things. It stimulates the immune system if it's light to moderate exercise, but we know that heavy exercise actually is detrimental to our immune system. Well, the same thing is true with the telomere, that we have a certain limited amount of activity that is beneficial for us with the telomere. But if we push the physical activity to a very high level, now we demand more nutrients. And if those nutrient demands aren't met, then of course we're going to affect the telomere length. So you sit there and you look at individuals that are into some very intense exercise, whether it's marathons, whether it's CrossFit, whether it's triathletes. You say, well, those athletes look very fit from the outside, but what is their body doing internally? And we see sometimes with those individuals that they develop autoimmune diseases or they develop cancer. And you say, well, how did that person develop those diseases when they exercise regularly, they eat healthy per se, and these particular diseases occur? And there's a lot of evidence to show why that happens. And once again, so when we look at physical activity, we have to balance it out with our nutritional status. And physical activity is stress. And some people say, well, it's a good stress. Well, yes, you can maybe say it's a good stress, but there's things that occur when that also occurs. Body mass index. We all know that, especially with this whole COVID situation, that we know that if a person's obese, that they're going to be more likely to not do well with COVID. Well, once again, our telomere length is going to affect our immune system. It's going to affect our immune system cells, the neutrophils, the lymphocytes, and things like that. So if that particular structure, the telomere, is damaged due to free radicals that maybe are produced from being overweight, obese, or going into the situation like diabetes, then we're going to have an issue. And so once again, our body mass index is very important to be maintained, and we want to make sure that we do that. Alcohol consumption. You hear people sometimes say, well, I've heard that, a glass of wine is good for everybody. Well, there's certain things in wine like resveratrol that definitely are protective of the telomere. There's research to back that up. The other thing, though, is alcohol in excess can cause problems because we know it works as a diuretic. It can cause a lot of nutritional deficiencies. Some of them that we'll definitely talk about tonight. One of them I already talked about, like magnesium. So this is something we also have to take into mind. So what amount of alcohol and what type of alcohol may be more beneficial than the other? And are there some consequences if people, once again, consume on a regular basis? Hormone replacement therapy is a hot topic today. A lot of people are getting testosterone or progesterone or estrogen replacement. So once again, this is something else to consider. And you hear sometimes that, testosterone is cardiovascular protective. Well, once again, these are some cells that may be affected, their telomere length may be affected, and that's how we get the benefit. But once again, do any of those hormones cause problems down the road or deficiencies? And the answer is definitely yes. And some of them are the B vitamins, and some certain deficiencies like D and zinc and E may actually affect the ability to make hormones in the body or maintain our hormone integrity. So that's another connection of nutrition with hormones. And of course, everybody today is talking about dietary intake of antioxidants. Well, you know, it's one thing to say that we're taking in antioxidants, but do we really know the amount of antioxidants that are in food? You know, a lot of these food-based information databases are looking back like 1989 or earlier as far as what the nutrient content of those foods were per gram or per cup or whatever. And so we really aren't up to date, and some of that food science information is lagging, and that really affects us because a lot of the food industry says, okay, this particular vegetable or fruit has this much vitamin C or vitamin A, and really does it? I mean, have we really investigated? And there's a lot of research out there showing that depending on where foods come from in the United States or other countries, do they have the same amount of mineral or vitamin per volume, that whether it's from the East Coast, the West Coast, you know, Southern United States, Northern United States. And we know that that's definitely is different. There's a difference in that. So that's important. Then we talk about the trace elements, you know, and talking about primarily the minerals in that particular category. There's certain vitamins that I'll talk about tonight that definitely are associated with telomere integrity. Once again, I can't cover all of them by chance, but hopefully I'll give you some ideas and connections and why the importance of looking at certain things. And I'm actually also going to connect a couple of other testings that you'll be interested in knowing about that are associated with telomere as well. So it's not just telomere length, or telomere integrity, but what other testings may give us some indication that a person's telomere is actually affected. And once again, some of them are very common to you and some of them might not be as common. Chronic inflammation. We always talk about inflammation today. You know, there's a lot of research out there showing today that as high as 60 to 70% of maybe all of the major chronic diseases are related to inflammation. And so once again, when we talk about inflammation, we have to talk about free radicals, because when we have inflammation, we produce free radicals. We increase the oxidative stress. And so that's something that we talk about. So, you know, people are always talking about omega-3s or, you know, ubiquinol or zinc or vitamin D, and, you know, so many nutrients that have anti-inflammatory effects. And so that's something also that affects the telomere. Socioeconomic status. We know that certain groups don't have the ability to have certain food items or the variety of foods. So that also comes into play. So it's something to consider depending upon what kind of practice you have, what kind of location, and, you know, what's the socioeconomic status of your clientele or your patients. Is there a large variety? Is it the upper group as far as economically, or is it middle class, or what group are you really dealing with? Stress is a huge, from an emotional standpoint, is a huge factor in telomere length. And this is something that's been researched by a lot of individuals back in the early 2000s. They're looking at how emotional stress, they look at people that are caregivers. We're finding out that people that are caregivers, whether it's for maybe diabetic parent or an Alzheimer's patient or something like that, how those family members are under this emotional stress and that telomere length has been shortened. Well, I don't have time to get into a lot of that from a nutritional standpoint, but there are definitely a lot of nutrients that are altered, or the status of those nutrients are altered when we are under emotional or physical stress. And one of them, from a emotional stress that's altered, is our magnesium status. And as you saw from just one previous slide, that magnesium has a role to play, and it has more information in this webinar this evening. So if you think about it, if this has ever happened to you, where you've been sitting at home or at your office and all of a sudden your cheek starts twitching or your eye starts twitching, that is a classic sign of magnesium deficiency. And if you go back and look at the times when that's occurred, you've been under some emotional stress. And I used to teach at an institution for numerous years. And I used to tell the students that usually around midterms or final exams, that your eyes, some of you will have an eye or cheek twitch for 2 or 3 days before my exams. And they used to always say, well, why is that? Why is that? Well, when we got to the point of magnesium information in the class, I explained why that happens. And then, of course, paternal age also comes into play with the telomere length. But once again, so you can see it's not just an easy solution of, oh, I'm going to eat this way, or I'm going to exercise this way, or I can or cannot consume alcohol or some other things. And the whole thing with stress in our life, because so many people have stress in various ways, but there's a lot of factors that come into play. But yet, this is a measuring mark on what's happening with our aging. And can we slow that process down? And absolutely we can. But once again, we have to do or consider a lot of these factors, or all these factors right here. So as I mentioned, oxidative stress is one of the major factors in the length of the telomere and the overall aging. And so the reason why is the guanine is highly contained in the telomere. It's a large structure, or not large structure, it's a high found structure in that particular product. And as a result, it's very prone to oxidative stress, meaning that it's very easily damaged when we have oxidative stress in the cell. And so for that reason, we have to try to cut down this particular process, or limit this process as much as we can. So one of the areas that telomere has received a lot of press is in the cardiovascular field. And this is a little schematic. It's an excellent schematic in this particular journal, published in September 2020, showing you how things occur and how cells are damaged, and eventually gets to the point of the cardiovascular event. And how, we talk about the smooth muscle cells and how important they are. And we want to make sure that we don't, of course, damage the endothelial cells and eventually get the plaquing and the foam cells produced and so on. So it shows you here in the middle of this particular schematic on what kind of promotes that from happening, what shortens the telomere. And once again, you can see B vitamin deficiencies and sleep deprivation. We're going to talk more about each of these a little further down. Smoking, decreasing your stress level. It's easy to say that, as I mentioned, but once again, it happens. So this is definitely one of the major conditions or fields that telomere research is being done. And of course, we all know that cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States, and has been for several decades. And so once again, this is why it's important. So how do we know if this is happening? Well, once again, we measure telomere length. So as I mentioned earlier, that there's some other conditions or some other testings that are correlated with the telomere. And I said to all of you that some of you may be familiar with this and some of you may not. Well, homocysteine has been around for numerous years. And this is definitely one factor that has a relationship with telomere length. So indirectly, if a person has an abnormal homocysteine, and this is where another test comes into play, then possibly, well, I highly recommend this to my patients, is that MTHFR is performed, that you check to see if they have abnormalities or mutations in the MTHFR. And if you do, if the patient does, I should say, then once again, another follow-up should be the homocysteine, or vice versa. If a person has an elevated homocysteine, then perform an MTHFR. If they have an abnormal MTHFR, then perform a homocysteine panel or test, a panel that has this. And you can see here that for every rise of 5 micromoles per liter of homocysteine, that there's a significant increased risk of coronary artery disease. Well, why is that? Well, once again, one of the reasons is because this particular product, this amino acid, is a factor with the telomere. And so if we have a elevated homocysteine, then of course we have a good assumption or reason to think that the telomere length is shortening. And which means that now we're more prone to chromosome damage. And this is something that we hear today. And to give you an example, because I mentioned this earlier, that Alzheimer's is associated with telomere length. Well, homocysteine in independent literature has also been associated with Alzheimer's. So they're, in a way, they're indirectly related to one another, but it's very important. Well, we also know that homocysteine is associated to stroke, associated to myocardial infarction, and associated with several other things. One condition or one disease that a lot of people don't really associate with homocysteine, but they should, is, of course, osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is actually accelerated with elevated homocysteines. So the assumption or the past thinking that homocysteine was only really related to vascular disease is not true. We know it's highly associated with central nervous system problem. We know it's associated with skeletal system integrity. So it's something that we need to know. And once again, so this is something that you want to monitor. And as I mentioned, this has been known for numerous years. So how does this come into play? How does homocysteine play a role, or why is that important? Because it has an effect on nitric oxide. And of course, we know that nitric oxide has a very strong correlation with the vascular system. And if this is particularly affected, then the vascular system affected. So it's also a pre-inflammatory product. It can go from homocysteine to homocystic acid. And when that occurs, we know that that's found in people that have like migraine headaches, that it actually can inflame the dura. And it's one of the reasons that we see that people that have migraines, not all people, but a lot of people that have migraine headaches have elevated homocysteines. And a lot of people don't know that because they don't even perform the homocysteine test. Well, then once again, you hear this in the literature that people that have higher incidence or have a history of migraines have a higher incidence of Alzheimer's. Well, isn't that interesting that homocysteine is associated with migraines, it's associated with Alzheimer's, it's associated with telomere length. So you can see where I'm going with this, that the telomere is telling us one thing, but there's other testing and other factors that we have to take into consideration on how is that telomere being affected. Is it just oxidative stress? Is it homocysteine elevation? What's really causing it, and what factors are involved? So here is some information showing you about the markers involved with inflammation, oxidative stress, of course, the homocysteine, the length of the telomere, and of course, mortality. And we know that all of them have been associated with these major diseases, especially cardiovascular disease. So we need to keep in mind all of these factors. And once again, we'll show you how that can be done. So what about dietary factors? Are there any dietary factors that have really been shown to alter our telomere length? And of course, the first thing is, what dietary factors have been shown to decrease oxidative stress? Because if we attack those or consume those foods that are high in antioxidants, we're going to attack or decrease the chance of oxidative stress. And you can see here that foods or food groups like fruits and vegetables have definitely been associated with that. Nuts and seeds have also been shown to be associated with that, primarily the walnuts, the almonds, and you'll see where I'm going with this as far as dietary, as far as general dietary, and also dietary fiber. They have found that for each 10-gram increase per day of fiber intake, the cell aging was 4.3 years less than the average. Now, what do most people say that we should consume as far as fiber? The minimum people say is 20 grams per day. Some people are saying 30 to 40 grams per day. Why is that? So it's not just colon health, but it's possibly affecting our telomere. And so once again, this is very important. So if you take all of these factors in mind, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, high fiber, what does that sound like? What diet does that sound like? That sounds like the Mediterranean diet, right? We haven't talked about, of course, fish on this particular slide yet, but we will be talking about omega-3s and how that comes into play. So once again, this is something that you want to keep in mind when you are talking to your patient and they say, well, what diet should I do? What should I do to kind of decrease my aging or slow down my aging process or decrease my oxidative stress? And these are definitely some of those particular suggestions. And probably all of you do this already. Well, what are some of the major vitamins that we've seen associated with the telomere? Well, once again, B12 and folate consumption has definitely been shown to help the telomere. And you can see here in this particular slide what percentage of the population in the US consumes B12 and folate in adequate amounts. And it's kind of interesting. You can see this is a pretty new article in 2019 that indicates this. And you would think more people, once again, would do this, but once again, a lot of people fall short of the RDA. And the RDA was really designed to, or developed or looked at to avoid chronic serious diseases like rickets and scurvy and things like that. But we have to go way above that now. We can't just look at those particular major diseases. What about these predisposing disease where a person goes into hyperglycemia, but they're not diabetic yet, or a person that's showing some vascular damage, but they're not yet into the cardiovascular event, like, a heart attack or something like that. So it's prevention. So, that's where the future is really developing or looking at the optimal intake of each individual. We all have a different biochemistry. We don't all need the same amount of B12 and folate and so on, but what's that connected to? Well, think about that. What are two factors that affect homocysteine? Two nutrients that affect homocysteine are B12 and folate. And so by looking at people that have low B12 and folates are also looking at a potential elevated homocysteine, which eventually will affect the telomere length. So here's some more information about how the deficiencies of these two vitamins have shown to have a substantial impact on clinical health issues. And the big issue, and what I talk to my patients about, is prevention, is subclinical. You might not have heart disease yet, or you might not have diabetes yet, or you may not have arthritis yet. But what are you doing to decrease inflammation, oxidative stress, psychological stress? Are you exercising? How much are you exercising? What's your alcohol consumption? Are you smoking? Various things like that. So there's all these things that we all hear about, but it's like, why are these things happening to the individuals in a rapid rate? If I mention to this, unless you've been in practice for a while, if I mention to you, what nutrients do you think have a big impact on oxidative stress? And I think most people would say vitamin C and zinc and vitamin D and things like that. Not too many people would really talk about B12 or folate on oxidative stress. But you can see here that they definitely have a role to play, because once folate and B12 are oxidized, they go through oxidative stress, they are no longer biologically active, which means they can't maintain our homocysteine. They can't maintain other factors, whether it's the myelin sheath of the nervous system. They can't maintain bone. A lot of people don't even relate folate and B12 with osteoporosis, but it is. We know that those two have a big impact, once again, on neuropathy with your diabetics. And so these particular B vitamins are very important, just like other common antioxidants that we hear about on a regular basis. So what are some things that really predispose us to some deficiencies of nutrients? And there's no way I can, because of the time frame, that I could mention all these medications out there that affect our nutritional status, but I just picked out a few. And common ones, things that I see every week in my practice. I see numerous diabetics that are on metformin. I see several patients that have GERD that are on proton pump inhibitors. And of course, I see a lot of people on statin medications. Now, even though statins have a benefit in regards to anti-inflammatory, there's some role that there's maybe an antioxidant effect. They also cause deficiencies. And these are some of the common deficiencies of statins. And CoQ10 is probably the most common one mentioned, but D3 and selenium and vitamin K also come into play. And of course, these also have a role with oxidative stress. And just like the B12, the folate, and do as far as the oxidative stress. So if you know patients, or you have patients that are on these particular medications, you right away say, boom, these are some nutrients that are probably low. These nutrients are associated with oxidative stress. And if they're associated with oxidative stress, they then are associated with shortening of the telomere, which eventually predisposes us to damage to the chromosome. And we get these things going on. And if you go into the literature, you'll see that B12 deficiency, once again, is highly associated with Alzheimer's. And once again, people on these particular medications like metformin, proton pump inhibitors, decrease B12. And you often hear people say, oh yeah, since I've been on that medication, my memory's going. Well, it's not just by chance, okay? Vitamin D has received a lot of press today, depending on who you read. There's some that say, the population, 40% of the population is low in vitamin D, and other people say maybe as high as 65 to 70%, or maybe even higher than that. And what affects our vitamin D status is a lot of things. Like I said, the statin medications affect it. Does a person have poor malabsorption or inadequate absorption that's causing vitamin D? Do they have a history of Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or leaky gut syndrome? All of that comes into play. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier that magnesium has a role with the telomerase and also the telomere. And here's some information why. And we know that magnesium, as you can see here, has over 600 enzymatic reactions. And so the health of the cell is so strongly dependent upon magnesium. And as I mentioned earlier, psychological stress lowers magnesium. Alcohol lowers magnesium. Caffeine, because of the diuretic effect, lowers magnesium. And yet it's a very important structure. I'm not saying you can't drink alcohol and your patients can't drink coffee from time to time. And yes, there's articles that say that coffee does have some benefits, and it does, and alcohol some benefits. But what is it doing to our nutritional status? And what are these micronutrients doing to the telomere or the telomerase? And so once again, very important. So you can see here that magnesium, as I mentioned earlier, has a huge role on some of these major diseases that we're trying to avoid today. Diabetes, Alzheimer's. There's information on cancer relationship and magnesium deficiency. Of course, we know blood pressure. We know myocardial infarctions. We know various things that come into play. And so once again, how is this mineral affecting our aging? Well, once again, if it's affecting our oxidative stress, then it's affecting our telomere or has a potential to do that, and we have to address it. And this is, once again, as I mentioned earlier, that magnesium plays a role in maintaining that telomere, the ends, the caps per se of the chromosome, by the activity of the telomerase. So the telomerase is very important for the maintenance or restoration or shortening, or I should say preventing the shortening of the telomere structure. So we know this, that the telomere breakdown or destruction definitely occurs faster in magnesium deficient conditions. And I showed you some data or some information on magnesium deficiencies and how often they occur. And once again, we know that, once again, as I mentioned, the relationship of this enzyme and magnesium. This is why, and I've said this to several of you that have listened to me in the past, and I say this in other lectures that I've done, If there's only really one nutrient that I could help or people with and maintain and keep in my office, it would probably be magnesium. Now, I want to relate this to another nutrient, and you all know this, that magnesium is very synergistic with vitamin D and vice versa. So when you talk about magnesium, you have to talk about vitamin D. And when you talk about vitamin D, you have to talk about magnesium. And then, of course, when you talk about vitamin D, you talk about K2 and various other things. So it's very, very intertwined with one another. And here's a great schematic. And this is out of Internal Journal of Molecular Science in January 2018, where they show you kind of the cell stress, and then they show you the telomere, and then they point out where magnesium comes into play, where it helps protect the mitochondria. It's involved in ATP production, and then it also has an effect on DNA and some other structures that, once again, overall affect the telomere. And so when it comes down to it, what are other things that can affect the oxidative stress? And like I said, there's numerous ones, but I just pointed some out just because of the limited time. But your omega-3s, we know that omega-3s help with oxidative stress. And this is why we're really pushing this particular product in society today. And once again, going back to dietary intake, what's a diet that is high in omega-3s? The Mediterranean diet. Now, I know you all have certain diets or recommendations and that's great. I'm just showing the literature, and I can also show you numerous pieces of literature, the Mediterranean diet and the chronic conditions. But there's a lot of changes out there today. People are doing keto and pescatarian and gluten-free, and sometimes we have to be on those particular diets, and they are beneficial for certain conditions, but what are they doing to our micronutrients? And then, of course, CoQ10. I mentioned earlier how CoQ10 was depleted or affected by the statins. And so once again, here we come into play. CoQ10 is essential for the mitochondria. And if the mitochondria isn't maintained, then the mitochondria integrity affects the telomere. So it's very important. So here's a summation kind of things that I talked about earlier on the slides, and this was published, you can see recently in April of 2021, how lifestyle affects the telomere and the oxidative stress and the damage, and how eventually we damage the lipids, the proteins. Of course, we have apoptosis, and then eventually that goes into the point of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, metabolic syndrome, and so on. So we can see how individual nutrients affect it. We can see how your lifestyle in relationship to like physical activity affects it, how your psychological status or maintenance or ability to decrease stress. I didn't put it in the slides today, but they've shown where, meditating has an effect on the telomere. And some of you, maybe all of you realize that or know that. But it's very important that we get our patients into a certain environment to decrease that stress, not just from a biochemical standpoint, but physical activity as well. So looking at some of these things, this is kind of a summation of how healthy lifestyles and oxidative stress are related in decreasing or improving the telomere, maintaining the telomere length. And these are positive things. These are things that have been shown out there to help maintain the telomere length. And you can see in the second to last bullet, it talks about the Mediterranean diet. Then we also see things like copper, iron, and magnesium, but also I'm going to show you how iron can actually be detrimental to us if we take too much. And then, of course, there's unhealthy lifestyles. You hear research or you hear different webinars out there that say, sleep is very important, that people that don't get so many hours of sleep are more prone to Alzheimer's or dementia or other things like that. So once again, that's very important. And of course, the psychological stress. The sugar intake, the carbonated beverages have been shown to be associated with shorter telomeres. Processed meats, once again, like I said, the heavy alcohol consumption, all of these have been shown to reduce the telomere. Now, what about iron? even though iron is very beneficial in several aspects, you can see here that we have also found that if people have high iron intake or status, and this was based on serum ferritin levels, that they definitely had a detriment to their telomere. And if they have a low ferritin, of course, iron also helps the immune system. So if someone has a low iron, it can be detrimental if someone has too high of iron. And so once again, this is something that we have to start looking at because of the relationship to telomere. And you can see this is a pretty new citation that was noted there. So hopefully those of you that knew nothing about telomeres or have heard of telomeres but didn't really know the structure, the importance, the relationship, now you know how important they are to protect our chromosome from damage. And we can change the integrity of the telomere through the telomerase enzyme, and we can affect that enzyme through certain lifestyle changes and or micronutrient changes. And also, we've found other laboratory diagnostics like the MTHFR, how the homocysteine, how those also correlate with the telomere. So if you are going to use the telomere test, and hopefully you will, to evaluate your patient, that you don't just look at that particular factor. And you also realize that there's no one magic bullet to maintain our telomere, that there's several things that we have to consider. And hopefully now this has opened your eyes to that and the importance of that. And I think we're going to see this. We're going to see in the future, and I'm thinking in the near future, a lot more research coming out on telomere and the importance of that and what we need to do with our patients from a preventative standpoint to decrease their chances of some of these devastating diseases. So I'll open it up to any questions that we have. I know we just have a few minutes, but once again, hopefully that's helped you understand the importance of the telomere.
Thank you, Dr. Grabowski. We'll get into some of the questions that we've received. Can nutrigenomic SNPs affect telomere?
Absolutely, because those SNPs, depending on what pathway they affect or what nutrient they may affect. For example, we know that like a vitamin D receptor abnormality can affect, of course, our vitamin D status. And if it affects that vitamin D status, which affects inflammation, which affects oxidative stress, it could definitely have a part to play.
Thank you. The next question is, Dr. Ron, do you think the synergy of TA65, SOD, and ficitin would be beneficial? Thanks.
Well, anytime we're looking at antioxidants, factors like the SOD, but once again, we have to look at, there's different types of SOD, of course. We know there's a copper relationship. We know that there's a manganese relationship. We know that there's a zinc relationship. So when you're looking at those particular factors, in a case of like the SOD, which one are you looking at? Are you looking at the manganese one? Are you looking at the zinc one? Are you looking at copper one? So we know those factors. So absolutely, those are going to be factors that come into play, and they're beneficial. But what nutrients, what micronutrients are involved with those particular factors, I think that's what's really important. If we talk about getting to the root of the problem, how do we improve our SOD? How do we improve some of these other protective mechanisms? And it all really comes down to the micronutrients, whether it's a micronutrient that makes an enzyme or is a cofactor or coenzyme to those particular factors. That's what I'm interested in. I think that's really what we have to look at.
Thank you. The next question is, are there any tests available to test the overall health of our mitochondria?
I don't know any real specific ones. I'm sure there are researchers out there that do it from a research standpoint. As far as from a clinical standpoint, I'm not aware of just specific mitochondrial function. There's so many nutrients that correlate with that function, but from a clinical standpoint, there may be. I have to be honest, I don't know from that standpoint. I research you hear, I read articles all the time on people that are investigating the integrity of mitochondria, but that's like a research setting versus clinical setting.
Thank you. Can infectious disease affect, like long COVID, shorten the telomere? If so, can shortened telomeres be recovered?
Oh, I think, any disease like that could cause the shortening or affecting the telomere and telomerase, because we know today in long COVID how certain nutrients, I see people that come to my office that have long COVID and we do nutritional evaluations on them. We see certain nutrients that are low. In fact, I'm kind of databasing right now in my clinic and getting some of this data. We see a lot of glutathione problems. We see a lot of selenium problems, of course, vitamin D, zinc, in these people that have long COVID. And if you're affecting those particular nutrients, or those particular nutrients are low, then of course you're going to affect the telomere and the telomerase capabilities. So I think it's definitely something. Of course, COVID is so new to all of us except for the last 2 years. But I think that's a very interesting topic of looking at COVID or long COVID individuals or long haulers per se, and what's happening to their telomeres and telomerase.
Thank you. Would body composition be a better judge of risk versus BMI? I would. Everybody's looking at BMI, of course, but yes, body composition definitely has a factor, because we do know that, the higher amount of fat per se that you have a higher chance of inflammation, and inflammation is accelerated with it. But what's also interesting is the thing about stress and body composition, because we know that when people are under stress, physical stress or psychological stress, that cortisol is released. Cortisol then has a big issue with fat composition. And also we know that adipose tissue also helps produce cortisol. And so it's all related, but it's definitely another factor that I would look at as a clinician. I think is very interesting, and definitely I would say as a rule, I don't know if I would say it's more important, but definitely another parameter that you could look at. Thank you. What types of B12 and folate do you recommend? Do you recommend injections?
I'm coming from the old school that, if the gut works, use it. And if it doesn't work, then figure out why it doesn't work and then fix it. Definitely injectable is beneficial to people. But, if your GI tract is healthy, there's no reason why you can't use oral B12. Definitely I'm more of a methyl and adenosine cobalamin individual, because we see so much, at least in our practice, we see so much MTHFR mutations. We see a lot of homocysteine elevations in our patients. So those are the forms that I look at and utilize from various companies. But yeah, I think there's times where people warrant the injectable, the IVs and things like that. But I don't think we should be sustaining people on injectables, because I think we really need to address the gut and maintain the gut. And we know that if we abstain from stimulating the gut, that then some of those enzymatic functions of our gut and overall absorption mechanisms are altered. And we know that when we put people NPO in the hospital for several days, that we can't just throw them back on a regular diet, that we have to titrate certain things so their bowels can handle it. So yeah, it's an adjunct, but I don't think people should become dependent on it.
Thank you. And we've got time for one more question. If we didn't get to your questions tonight, please feel free to send in those questions to support@spectracell.com, and we can make sure that those get to Dr. Grabowski and answered. The last question will be, have you seen any nutrient deficiencies associated with myoclonic jerking besides magnesium? What are your thoughts on functional medicine approaches for same?
I have B6 is one that I see. carnitine and CoQ10 have also been there. One of the things that's very interesting, I think, when we deal with the nervous system is the phosphorylation of nutrients. And of course, that phosphorylation process is highly dependent upon magnesium. It also is affected by zinc. And when I talk about that, I'm saying like, your phosphorylation of your B6, when most of the time people take, pyridoxine hydrochloride in, and of course, the active form is P5P. Well, in order to do that P5P, you have to have that phosphorylation process, and there's other nutrients that affect that. So when people say, well, I've tried B6 for that condition and a neurological condition, it didn't work. Well, I say to them, well, did you check their magnesium and did you check their zinc? And they'll say, why? Or why use B1 in the form of thiamine hydrochloride, but it didn't work. In some studies, it shows it works. In some studies, it doesn't. Well, my point to the question is, are you looking at these other synergistic nutrients that have a large role in maintaining or converting the nutrients to their active form? It's just like vitamin D. A lot of people take vitamin D and they say, well, my serum vitamin D is good, but my intracellular is bad. Well, why is that happening? Is it a receptor problem? Is it a cell membrane problem? Is it a hydroxylation problem, which is dependent upon magnesium? And that's why a lot of times I think more and more people are realizing this, that when we look at nutrition research, and I've done research and we always try to limit the variables, but when you do nutrition research, you have to look at a lot of other factors of synergistic or antagonistic nutrients. And when you try to isolate one nutrient and say this will help that or that will help another condition, is did you look at all of the nutrients that have a role in that particular condition? Like, and since we talked about this is a neuromuscular condition here, the myoclonal, is like neuropathy. I hear this all the time from patients that have been to neurologists or been to other individuals and say, well, yeah, my doctor says my neuropathy is not nutrition related because my B12 and folate is good. Well, yeah, that sounds good, but there's like 13 nutrients that are associated with neuropathy. So did you look at all 13 nutrients or did you just look at 2? And so what then they say is, oh, your neuropathy is idiopathic. No, it's not idiopathic. That clinician did not investigate all the nutrients. And that's what's so exciting about where we're going forward with nutrition is I still feel like we're in infancy with nutrition. I mean, it's come a long ways. I've been in this field for 41 years, but it's getting to be really ramping up right now. And it's exciting because we're starting to see all these correlations. So my advice to all of you out there is don't try to get stuck on 1 or 2 nutrients or 1 or 2 products. That the body has numerous functions with different nutrients and several other nutrients. And it shouldn't be intimidating to you. It should be exciting to you that you are an investigator. You're, like this detective out there that's trying to find these connections between these various nutrients. And that's what I find so exciting today in my practice. I mean, I'm probably more excited today, 41 years later, than I was 41 years ago. And it's because I see this, and I tell clinicians this all the time, that we're at a very important time of healthcare. People are demanding functional medicine. I mean, there's an article in Time magazine, if it wasn't last year, it was 2 years ago, that stated, it was a special edition, that stated that the healthcare in the future will be functional medicine. It will be nutrition. It will be acupuncture. It will be things that people are doing today, meditation, various things like that. So it's a very exciting time of healthcare, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Grabowski. Well, that concludes the presentation for tonight. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Grabowski, for the insightful information as always, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Looking forward to next month's webinar. Thank you.